Now, for those of you who've been joining in the last few minutes, we're asking everybody who joins the webinar to just enter their name and their location, as well as the organization they're working for, in the chat box, which should be attached to the screen, or in the questions section. And so that way we will get to know all of you who are on the webinar. We'll be able to let you all know that you're each here, and we'll be able to see both the geographic scope and the organizational scope of all of you who are joining us today. So you should be able to type in a question. It basically comes up as a question, and you can let us know who you are and where you're calling in from today. So I see there are some people coming in from Thunder Bay, from I think from Paro also, from Luke's Place in Oshawa, from Nawakan Friendship Centre, from Prince George and Terrace in BC, from Capital W in Toronto, and Healthy Communities in Scarborough. So I'm just going to give you a few more minutes so that we can see a little bit of the scope that everybody has, but we are going to start with the content of the webinar. There's a group, Big Brothers Big Sisters in Toronto has joined too, and we'll just start off with the content. We have a lot to cover this morning, so I'm going to move ahead if that's all right with everybody. We will share the slides with you following this presentation. We will stop for questions at any time you have a question. Now that you've had the practice of entering some information into the chat box, that's the same place that you can pose questions. In some cases, if it's a small thing, we will answer it right away in the text box, so you'll be able to see a response from us. In another case, we might just pause and answer for everybody so that everyone has that same information. So feel free, you can also, everybody's mic is muted at this point. So if you do need to interject and you want to stop us, you can raise your hand. There's a button above where your name is listed where you can raise your hand if you need to do that. And we will stop and unmute your mic so that you can speak, but otherwise your mic is automatically muted on our end of things. That's just to stop everybody's background noise interfering with the sound quality. We have Twitter handles that you can use, so at Canadian Women's Foundation or at Innoweave, to follow things like announcements about grants and information that will be coming up about who we are or what's coming up for any of our organizations. We're also recording this session, so if that's a problem, I suggest that one of the things you choose not to do is perhaps not share your name or not share your interact through the chat, and you can send us an email afterwards if you would like to follow up with us about that. There'll be an email address at the end of the webinar. So we've already started recording, so with that I will move on. You'll get an email with the recording of this webinar attached. And I'll just let everybody introduce themselves. This is Annelies Dugal. I'm the Director of Community Initiatives and Policy at Canadian Women's Foundation. I've been with the foundation for about 12 years. I'm based in Montreal, and I am very happy to be joining you today.
Hi, my name is Annelies, just popping on my webinar or webcam. We'll be keeping them off for the duration of the webinar just to make sure that the sound quality is the highest possible, but we thought we'd say a quick hello. So I'm working as a project consultant to help launch this investment readiness program with the Canadian Women's Foundation based in Vancouver. I'm grateful to be here today with all of you.
Great, and hello everyone. My name is Wayne Miranda. I am the Investment Readiness Lead at McConnell Foundation, and I just recently joined McConnell. I was previously the Director of Growth at the Center for Social Innovation and Managing Director of TechSoup Canada. And before then, I was doing sort of 10 years of impact investing abroad. So happy to be here. Great.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I'll turn off my webcam. So we just want to acknowledge, first of all, before we begin, that all of us, wherever we're seated currently or perhaps standing, are located on traditional, ancestral and likely unceded territory. We want to recognize the role that First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples have played and continue to play as guardians of the land and water on these lands in which we gather, physically in our spaces, all across this huge expanse of land. And we want to respect that role that they play as we begin this work, knowing that there is an ongoing relationship colored by colonization and systemic racism, and also ongoing violence towards Indigenous women that constitutes genocide, as stated by the report on the inquiry of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And for Canadian Women's Foundation, it's important that we state this because our work as we move forward is being influenced and adapted according to the calls for action from both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women, and that it's important for all of us to think about how our work and our relationships can be improved and can increase in scope with this acknowledgement and understanding of the truth of the history of Canada and the truth of the ongoing relations between its governments and First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples.
Thank you for that, Anna. So we have a packed hour today together with all of you. So we're going through the introductions at the moment. Innoweave has partnered with us to deliver this webinar, and they'll be Wayne will be sharing about the $2 billion social finance opportunity and introducing the start of the Investment Readiness Program. Then we'll talk a bit about what the Investment Readiness Program looks like specifically with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and then we'll have space for more discussion and questions at the end. As we mentioned, if you have questions throughout, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box or to raise your hand. So I will pass it over back to Anu to share a little bit more about the foundation for those of you that are new to the organization.
Thanks very much, Annelies. So as you may already know, Canadian Women's Foundation was set up in 1991 to fill a gap for women's philanthropy, seeing that in spite of what might be legal or what appeared to be in law reforms that guaranteed women equity and equality, in reality this was not happening. And so it was established in 1991 to gather important resources that would be made available to organizations working in these fields of preventing gender-based violence, alleviating poverty and supporting women's economic development, to promote inclusive leadership and champion girls' empowerment throughout all parts of the country. We also have a focus on helping communities or organizations which perhaps have the least access to this kind of philanthropic funding. We do try to make that one of the criteria with which we look at our work. And we also try to consider the location of different organizations. As we developed recently an updated strategic plan, we just want to share with you some of these things have not changed. We've also always focused on philanthropy. We've always invested in women and girls, and we've always had a focus on building capacity of organizations and communities. Those things are not changing, but moving forward, we'll be taking a much bigger role in looking at advocacy and ways to mobilize on multiple levels for change, societal change, and to get closer to gender equity. And we also will be working to amplify national conversations through our thought leadership, which includes being present at multiple types of tables so that the information about how to gather our strength in terms of women's equity can be shared throughout bigger and bigger circles of influence in the country.
Thanks, Anu, and I'll pass it over to Wayne now to take on the next section.
Sure, thank you, Annelies. So many of you are likely familiar with Innoweave, but for those who might not be, I'll just briefly mention some bullet points here. So Innoweave is actually an initiative and program of the McConnell Foundation. The McConnell Foundation is both a responsive foundation, so we respond to inbound proposals, as well as it runs its own programs in Indigenous reconciliation, around moving to a low carbon economy, around community well-being, and a broad definition of that. And it's an 80-year-old family foundation with a specific focus on social innovation. Innoweave actually spun out of that, recognizing roughly around 2012 that there was organizational needs identified through our work and through the partnerships that were around capacity and strengthening of the organization. And so since that time, we've reached thousands of different organizations, not unlike today where people attend an informational session. 500 or so of those projects have gone on to access funding, to purchase coaching and services across 10 different social innovation streams to help those organizations adopt a social innovation approach and enhance their impact. And so today and right now, we'll zoom in on just one of those streams called social finance. And just to lay out a working foundation for today, a definition of sorts. So social finance is repayable investment that generates a positive social, environmental, and/or cultural impact, and stressing it's repayable investment. So it's not necessarily a grant, it is a loan or it's equity, and we'll come back to some of that terminology. And that money is used to advance your impact towards activities that you can implement, and at some point in future needs to be repaid back to those investors. And so a key point here is that social finance is really a means to an end. It's not an end to itself. So to share some examples of how this looks and how this can actually be used in organizations, you can see on your screens 5 different use cases for how social finance can be used amongst nonprofits, charities, social enterprise for-profits, cooperatives, hybrids of all of the above. So the first one is that an organization may be able to purchase an asset, like a building for a co-working space or an event space, or a vehicle to expand their geographic coverage for social services. Another example is organizations can use social finance for cash flow needs. So you might need to spend now in order to earn revenue later by just meeting payroll until, say, a government contract payment arrives into the bank account. Or an organization may need to spend now to say do an energy retrofit, which would prevent costs later by reducing utility bills. Organizations may also go the route of starting a social enterprise to use earned income strategies to create and sustain their impact. So for instance, a group could launch a business that might be employing underemployed staff, perhaps those facing poverty or those with disabilities, or an organization may scale an existing social enterprise into new geographies, for example, or to reach new types of customers, or to deepen the offerings that are already being delivered to existing customers. And so next, what I'll try to do is go through each of these types of use cases with real life examples. And hopefully you can notice that social finance can be used by many types of organizations, by many sizes of organizations across many different sectors across Canada. Some may require millions of dollars and some may require just a few thousand. So this first example is one that you might be familiar with. YWCA Toronto raised over $1 million towards building affordable housing. And essentially they built the Elm Center, as it's called, and it's 300 units of permanent housing, specifically for low-income women, women-led Indigenous families, women with mental health issues. So what they did was set various income caps per the different size of housing units, along with transparent and publicly set rent prices, which are below market rate. And what they've done now is worked with the government to receive rent supplements that make up the difference between what the residents can pay and what the market rate would actually be to then repay their investors. So that's the next example is one from the arts sector. So Center 3 for Print and Media, which is actually co-founded by 2 female co-founders. It is an artist-led workspace for artists to create and also exhibit art, as well as engage the greater Hamilton area, in this case, in arts education. they've raised $35,000 to essentially hire a development officer. So the money went towards hiring and paying the salary of that development officer. This additional team capacity helped raise money for both repaying the loan from, in this case, Community Forward Fund, but it also went to generate unrestricted funds for the organization. So that's new resources that can be put towards their mission. Another example, the Southern First Nations Network of Care provides services and programs specifically targeting Indigenous children and youth in Manitoba. They raised $2.6 million to connect at-risk Indigenous mothers with doulas, which are birth helpers. The objective is to prevent babies from spending time in the child welfare system during their first year of life, and so this prevents public healthcare costs. And by achieving specific agreed upon targets, which can be verified by third parties, the government of Manitoba will repay their investors. A fourth example is the Discourse, which is led by Aaron Miller, actually striving to basically create a thriving investigative journalism sector, telling stories that really matter to local communities. And so here the objective was to really go deep in select communities to create positive change amongst underrepresented people, particularly privileging feminist and diverse perspectives. So they took the path of raising $350,000 through an equity crowdfunding campaign, and they used that to produce more content, and this content's delivered digitally to readers who are subscribed in a pay-what-you-can model. And so they use these subscription revenues that will eventually go towards repaying their investors. And the last example, though we could go on all day if we wanted to, is an organization called Common Good in Calgary. So they employ people facing poverty through a sustainable commercial laundry service. They actually originally launched with humble beginnings. They started in a basement of a local Calgarian homeless shelter. And the co-founder, Hannah Cree, recognized that there was just systemic and unfair barriers facing homeless people in the city. And so they worked at this. After 1.5 years, they actually raised expansion capital to purchase a commercial laundry plant. So this is an example of scaling an existing social enterprise. They took on the previous owner's client list of this commercial laundry plant. They were actually able to increase by 150% the number of employment hours for their staff. And so they used these revenues from the laundry service to repay their investors. And so I hope these 5 different the brief examples of social finance at work kind of paints a picture for how your organization can also use social finance to enhance your impact. And next I'll speak about how you can actually do that. So there is this $2 billion social finance opportunity. One of the key initiatives for this is the new Social Finance Fund, which you might have heard about. So this is a new federal government initiative from Employment and Social Development Canada to increase the amount of affordable capital available to organizations with a social, environmental, and/or cultural mission. And so ultimately, the objective is to create a vibrant social finance market. The total amount of money available is, well, first a commitment of $755 million from the federal government towards this fund program. This comes with an objective to match those funds by the private sector to reach a total of $2 billion available over the next 10 years. And just a note, the expectation is not that every investment, so for yourselves as organizations, not every investment needs to be matched by the private sector, so it's not matching funds. It is rather that at the end of the day, we expect to see $2 from the private sector for every $1 in public investment. The fund is fairly legal structure agnostic. So if you're a nonprofit, a charity, a cooperative, a for-profit with a social enterprise core mandate, or a hybrid of any of the above, you are eligible. And the way that you would access those funds is through social finance investors. So you would be able to access loans, equity, revenue share agreements, all sorts of different types of instruments, as they're called. We do not know exactly who those social finance investors are yet because the contracting is still underway, but we can take some educated guesses, and I might have mentioned some earlier. So for instance, the Community Forward Fund, New Markets Fund, credit unions, And there's also likely to be new fund structures setting up as we speak. And similarly, we don't quite know exactly what that interest rate on the loan would be or what that return expectation for an investor might be, but we do expect it to be below market rate interest rates, as the federal government will also be investing on concessional terms. So how does this sort of social finance fund work? If we can go on. Essentially what you can see in this simplified visual is you've got ESDC and private investors working alongside each other, investing into these social finance intermediaries. And the intermediaries will then invest into investment-ready social purpose organizations. And one thing to note is that it's not expected that that whole 700 million is going to be available all at once. It's going to be invested over time, so somewhat of a ratchet up approach, as it said. It might look like, say, just for illustrative purposes, maybe $100 million the first year, maybe an additional 100 million the subsequent year, and so forth, maybe 70 million the following year, and it ratchets up for the next 10 years. And after the first 10 years of those investments being made, then we see the following 10 years where that return of capital and the repayments start to happen, and a ratchet down pattern begins to emerge. So you can see there's two key things here. One, I'll stress that it's investment ready social purpose organizations that would access the funds, and so we'll come back to that. As well, I want to point out that these are double-sided arrows, so the funds flow both ways. Investment to the right and repayments to the left. And so now the burning question, of course, is, well, how do I, as an organization, benefit from this $2 billion opportunity? And I think to do that, first we should recognize that there's two key things. One, we will recognize there's different stages of organizations all coming to this program, and that every stage of the organization requires different needs and supports to meet your needs. So we can go on. So the Investment Readiness Program tries to work with you and supports you at any stage. So some organizations may just be ready to access capital. You've got the organizational capacity, you've got an investment ready project, and you just need to access that investment and begin implementation. And you might still benefit from supports around legal advice or through investor relations or through advice to raise that capital. And if you're not quite there yet, that's okay. Perhaps you need to still develop the investment case. And so you might be starting with clear project idea that you have and as to what you want to do and how this aligns with your mission. But you might still need support to meet those investor requirements. So perhaps to explain the financial model to an investor or to prepare and manage that investment and become implementation ready yourself. And if you're not quite at that investment case, perhaps you're starting a little bit earlier. Maybe you have a concept in mind and you just need to clarify that idea. You need to test your hypotheses or test your assumptions, and you need to assess for yourself what your investment readiness needs are. So you might be supported through that. And if you're not quite there yet, maybe you don't have an idea yet, that's also okay. You can attend sessions like this, and there's lots of other partners where you can learn about social finance. You can better understand how social finance can benefit organizations. You can even have facilitated sessions to generate ideas on how you can also use social finance in your organization. As well as at the end of the day, once you've identified your needs in this investment readiness continuum, then you can apply for grants, and we'll come to that shortly. One of the organizations, of course, is hosting this webinar, Canadian Women's Foundation, and these grants are meant to provide one-time supports for you to build out that business plan or build out that financial model or get legal advice from various service providers, be that S4ES or Raven Indigenous Capital or Lift Philanthropy, SVX in Toronto, or 50 other coaches, consultants, organizations that we can help point you towards. And so in summary, just to share the last sort of what you need to know, at a glance, if we can advance to the next slide. The objective of the Investment Readiness Program is to strengthen your organization to really participate and make the best use of social finance. In total, it's a $50 million grant program and 2 years for organizations to access that. Again, the eligibility mirrors the social finance fund. And so it's, if you are a nonprofit, if you're a charity, if you're a cooperative, if you're a social enterprise for profit, or if you're a hybrid of any of the above, you would be eligible. And again, recall that the use of the funds are for one-time expenses to become investment ready. So anything in your journey that you can say and justify gets you investment ready or to participate in the social finance marketplace will be permitted. The ineligible proceeds or use of proceeds would be, an ongoing or core operating expense or something like a real estate purchase, even though you might be able to justify or argue, if I purchase real estate, I would be able to use that as collateral. Still, like a real estate purchase wouldn't be ineligible. The way the grants would flow is by applying to these organizations listed, so community foundations, the Canadian Women's Foundation, Chantier in Quebec, and NACA and the National Association of Friendship Centers for Indigenous-led organizations. And so what we can do maybe right now is just pause for questions, and then I will hand it back to Annelies.
Thanks so much, Wayne. So just a reminder to folks, if they have a question, they can either type it into the chat box or raise their hand if they want to take the mic. I see one hand raised. Let me just scroll to. Oh, and they got shy and put their hand down. So, yeah, so there will be time in the subsequent section as well for questions. And as always, you can reach us by email or by phone as well if you have follow-up questions. So without any obvious questions right now, I will thank Wayne and move us on to the next section of the webinar. So thank you so much. Wayne did an amazing job of talking about these different stages of investment readiness. Exploring social finance, clarifying a project idea, developing the investment case, and accessing capital. The federal government and this ESDC Investment Readiness Program has also identified different stages, and so they framed it as the Investment Readiness Continuum. So 5 stages of preparation towards investment readiness. The Canadian Women's Foundation is eager to support organizations at any stage along this continuum. So we're not prioritizing organizations that are more investment ready or less investment ready. Our key goal is to advance people along this continuum. So from early stage innovation all the way to investor readiness, and applicants can submit a request for services or support to help them advance along this investment readiness continuum. But as I said, we won't prioritize a certain stage. And I just wanted to show a bit of a simpler depiction of the 3 categories of partners that are part of the Investment Readiness Program. So as Wayne mentioned, we have the readiness support partners, so the Canadian Women's Foundation, Chantier, NACA, NAFC, and community foundations. And community foundations is actually the lead on this partnership, and so they're setting up some coordination pieces as well to try and standardize some of the application process and support process. We have the list of expert services providers that have received funding from ESDC for this work, but we are also open to funding any organizations who want to access services from other providers. So we aren't prioritizing where people access services from, but we are putting out this list of expert service providers if you are looking for someone to get support. Oh, sorry about that, to access support from. And then lastly, we have ecosystem mobilization initiatives, which are filling gaps currently in the ecosystem. So one gap that has been identified is lack of evaluation support for social innovation projects and lack of ability to demonstrate social impact, because we're not just looking at a financial bottom line, we're looking at a social bottom line as well. And so there's some organizations that have been funded to develop some evaluation processes, as well as other tools and supports to support the overall ecosystem. When it comes to the Canadian Women's Foundation granting, we have 3 cycles of funding. The first was launched last week, and we're dubbing it a little bit the fast track because it is a bit of a shorter time period. So it's 1 month, whereas the subsequent 2 cycles, we aim to have them open for 6 weeks, and we will provide more capacity building support to applicants in the lead up to those. And so this is really a fast track for organizations that already know what is needed to get them to the next stage of the investment readiness continuum and can apply for that. It's a single stage funding application process, and we have an online application system that you should see referenced on our website. And we aim to fund approximately 20 grants of up to $50,000 each, and are prioritizing also saving funds for the subsequent 2 cycles of funding to make sure that nobody who misses out on this first one feels that all the funding is sort of taken up. We really want to save and make sure we're supporting others to apply for funding for those subsequent cycles. And this first cycle of funding will be dispersed in January 2020. So I'll just pass it to Anu briefly to touch on the Canadian Women Foundation's overall approach to funding.
Great, thank you very much, Annelies. So the Canadian Women's Foundation, as you might already know, really prioritizes addressing different sorts of barriers in the funding that we give out. So we want to, first of all, make sure that when we're talking about women and girls, there is an understanding that that includes trans people, Two-Spirit, and non-binary peoples. And of course, we include these not only for the reasons of being particularly in need of the same sort of equity addressment, ways of working that women and girls need to be considered under, but also because these are people who experience the most serious levels of discrimination and often have the least access to funding and support. So we want to make sure that the programs are not only for Two-Spirited LGBTQI peoples, as well as women and girls with disabilities, Black women and girls, or women and girls who are from First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, but that the leaders of the programs also reflect the people who they're directly working for, and that the people who are in need of the services are not just consulted, but are involved in how those services are delivered, so that there's a complete sort of circle of influence and help around individuals or communities that have particular needs that represents who they are and where they're coming from, and that it's not a top-down approach but very much a grassroots approach. So we want to make sure that that's very clear in this cycle too. There's not, we wouldn't change any of the ways we work for the Investment Readiness Program. These are the communities who are also being prioritized in our Investment Readiness Program.
Thanks, Anu. We also just wanted to touch briefly on what documentation is required for the application. So all of this information is listed on the website, but there will be some overview organizational information. And if you're applying as an organization, or sorry, as an individual, please indicate the partner organization information that you will be working with. In addition, there'll be space to capture information about your social purpose, social innovation, business initiative. And so that's really where you can detail the initiative that you're applying for funding with. And then you will also be indicating what kind of service or support you need to access in order to advance along the investment readiness continuum. And then there will be detailed proposal questions. And we have a guide that I will show you briefly afterwards that indicates sort of advice on how to complete these questions most effectively. But these will include purpose of your initiative, activities, approach, partnerships, etc.
And so when we are asking you to submit your application, one of the things we'd like to make sure that you have the opportunity to tell us is the background to the service you're asking for. So as Wayne already explained, the idea of the granting is to provide you with a service that will improve your readiness to be able to access social finance at some future date. In the meantime, we know that there is an ongoing initiative that is in line with that service. So we don't need you to explain that initiative at length. The focus of the application is really on the service you're asking for and why that service is important. But we do give you an opportunity to add into the application materials, some kind of table or infographic or overall description, very simple, one page, to just give us an idea of what the initiative is all about, so that we can see the connection between your initiative and the service that you're asking to be funded to access. So that's one thing. If you don't have it, it's fine. That's why we've put if applicable for all of these things. Most of them are optional, but if you do have them, we really strongly recommend that you include them. They are needed in order for us to be able to address the questions we have about your organization, your initiative, the service, and the governance of that you're working system that you're working with. And when we speak of governance, of course, we need your current board list, or a band council list. Again, this is important so that we know that you have a board that, again, is representative of your community. We don't need details, we need names and the role that they play or the responsibility they have in your organization. For the audited financial statements, we assume most organizations with a budget of over around 400 or 500,000 would normally have audited financial statements, but we understand smaller organizations may not have the means or the wherewithal to provide them. If audited statements are not possible, then we ask for the financial statement that you present to your board with an outline of what your financial health is. It doesn't have to be audited, but we still need a statement. The same goes for annual reports. It may not be possible to provide us with an official report that you publish every year, but again, we assume you give reports to your board on the progress of your activities, so we can receive that. The policy of for diversity and anti-racism is important. If you have one, if you don't, then there's a question on the application form where you'll be able to fill in your approach or where you're at, how you work to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in your organization and through your programs. The letters of support are not optional. We really do want you to send us letters of support from organizations that you're working with. And then you have a space to add additional documentation as you see fit. I see that there is a question about this particular investment from Canadian Women's Foundation, and I'm sorry, there might be a little bit of background noise as my window is open. But the reality of this grant is it is a one-time investment that does not have to be paid back from Canadian Women's Foundation to you as an organization in order to access a service that will bring you closer to the accessing of social finance at some future date. So what we're offering is not social finance, it is a grant that will bring you as an organization closer to social finance. But as Annelies mentioned, based on those stages on a continuum that are not necessarily always completely linear and can be quite iterative. So I hope that explains that question for you, and it's really helpful to get questions as we go along. So please do feel free to drop them in the chat box as we go.
Thank you, Anu. I just wanted to also reference a few attachments to the application process that you will find useful in completing the granting. So the first is a detailed document that includes all of the questions that will be asked in the application, as well as guidance on your answer. And so it fleshes out what we are looking for in your answers and what the advisory committee and the staff will be basing your application on. It also includes a word limit for all of the questions. In addition, we have a frequently asked questions document, which details sort of the top questions we've already been asked or that are asked usually about the Canadian Women's Foundation grants in general. And then I'll just pop out and show you the third document, which is the grant criteria. And so this document details the Canadian Women's Foundation's overall approach to granting and what we do and do not fund, but then it also talks specifically about the Investment Readiness Program Grants and the program-specific criteria for those grants. So we are coming to the end of our session now. And have a healthy amount of time for questions. So we'd really love to encourage you to be asking them now. We will have another webinar next week that dives in a bit deeper into application submission and how to leverage social finance. And then we also have a Q&A open office hours session the week following on October 8th. So we hope to have you join for some of those as well, but I'll leave the floor open now for questions.
So there's a question in the question box that says, to clarify, we can apply for a grant up to $50,000 to access social capital. So I'll just maybe say it another way. So you can apply to a grant from Canadian Women's Foundation of up to $50,000 to move yourself along the stages of the continuum of social financing. So the grant may not be the way you access social capital, if that's the grant is to move you along a continuum so that you end up closer to accessing social finance. And then there's another question, is there evidence we need to provide that we have social capital lined up? No, it depends on where you are on the continuum. The evidence that we ask you to provide is to show that you are on the point in the continuum that you believe yourself to be on. So if you are ready to access social finance, then you would show us that you are ready to access social finance by using some of the key pointers that are mentioned earlier on in this webinar. And that our funding would support you in being ready to have those key documents or key materials ready through supportive services so that you can access social finance.
And Anu, I can jump in and tag the next one to save you some breath. The question is, if we apply for this funding, are we still permitted to apply for other funding streams? So yes, you are able to apply for other funding streams through the Canadian Women's Foundation grants. For this, we do need you to be showing how this specific investment will advance you along the investment readiness continuum. So we can't fund something that has already been funded or that is being funded by another program by the foundation. We really need to see how this will advance you differently, but you are welcome to apply to other Canadian Women's Foundation grants, and you're also open to apply for granting from some of the other partners, so the other 4 partners, though I believe we're not funding the same service or support to the same organization. And so if you're selected for both of those, then there will be a need to opt into working with one granting organization over another.
Great, thanks Annelies. So we'll tag team the questions. So I'm just going to respond to both questions from Mia about the social finance piece of the work. I would suggest that we put you in touch with some of the members of the, if you like, the ecosystem, as we call it, that are involved in offering social finance, so that you can connect with them. There is a list already on the website of ESDC, on the government website. If you put in ESDC Investment Readiness Program, you will get a list of all the groups that have been funded through this initiative, and that will include some of the organizations that can give you advice on social finance. I believe Innoweave could also give you advice on social finance, and that's exactly the kind of tailored support that many of the partners around the table can offer an organization. You can go to one of those organizations, explain the support you need. They can say, sure, we can do this. This is roughly how much it'll cost. And then you come back to Canadian Women's Foundation with a request for funding to support you to take that step and do that work together. I think that's another simple way of explaining, hopefully, how you can work through the process to benefit yourselves and where you are on the continuum.
Thanks, Anu. And it looks like Patty's question has been answered, but yeah, we'll have this expert list that you can access services through and apply to the foundation to garner that support or that funding to access those services. And I'm just seeing from Gwen, if our organization already receives funding from the foundation, could this funding be used to add an innovative feature for the existing program? So it could be used to advance one of your existing programs and to make it more investment ready. I would say we are really prioritizing that investment readiness. So if it's just going to increase the value that the program has, we're not able to provide programmatic funding, but it is going to bring something new that will potentially create a revenue generating element to your program, some social enterprise opportunity that spins out of your program, then we would be able to fund that piece. Where did we get to now?
I was just answering Mia's question actually in the box to saying that she'd like to connect to people to sit down and ask 1,000 questions. We will connect you to somebody, Mia, in Nova Scotia. There are some groups that we've met who we can do that for. So if you want to take Nancy's question, Annelies.
Yeah, so when looking at the purchase of an asset, for example, a new space, can this be used towards the actual cost of the purchase or only in preparation of securing the purchase? I believe you can reference the FAQ. There is a question here that says, yeah, I mean, there's pieces about funding furniture, office equipment. I believe that we're not able to provide specific funding for, let me just refer back to your question here.
Yeah, and you're right, Annelies, it cannot be used for the actual purpose, but it can be used, but it can be used in preparation for the purchase.
Yes. Can money be allocated for staff training for specific to programs within the organization? So it could be allocated for staff training if that will help advance the investment readiness of your initiative. So again, it can't just be a specific program that we are funding or even staff training to support a program. But if it's going to bring something new, something innovative or some entrepreneurial or investment forward element, then you would be able to apply for that staff training. Come to a bit of a standstill after a flurry of questions. So could it?
Could it be used for board of director training? Absolutely, yes, it can be used. So if you were to say to yourselves, well, we need to understand the legal ramifications of taking on a social purpose enterprise, and your particular service would be, we all need to understand that legal reality. Well, then the training would be perhaps for your board, for your ED, for your staff, perhaps for your participants, for the people involved, community members, whoever would need to know what that meant to take on that particular legal responsibility. That might be an example of a service that you could package up and say, this is how we're going to use this money. This is the service we need to support us as an organization moving ahead on the investment readiness continuum. And it may also be, we know we need to access finance. We don't know where the finance comes from. We don't know how we prepare ourselves for a financial loan of this kind. Again, you could use it amongst all many other services. Board of director training could be one of those things that you would need. So I think we would just sum it up by saying it's not the service itself. Could be one of many, many things. It could be a needs assessment, it could be a training session, it could be mentorship, it could be ongoing accompaniment by an entrepreneurship expert of some kind, it could be the kind of programming and support that Innoweave offers, it could be financial modeling in terms of being able to understand how your price relates to the income you need to generate, relates to your offering. All of those things are the kinds of services you could access with these grants. But the focus would be for us that the service makes sense in line with your initiative, and that you've made the case that that initiative is important in your community. And those would be the kinds of questions and connections that we will be asking as we examine your application and things, the kind of thing we'll get into more detail with our second and third webinar, where we dive into a bit more detail about what the application is all about and what the criteria are that we're looking for.
Great. So at this time, we will wrap up the webinar. I want to thank Wayne from Innoweave for joining and sharing their support for this program. You're welcome to reach out to them for support as well. And again, a thank you to the Government of Canada's Investment Readiness Program for this funding. And to Anu for sharing all of the content as well. Applications are due October 18th. So please get your information as soon as possible and make sure to be connecting with us if you have questions in the interim. We'll be happy to support you. The best way to reach us is social innovation at Canadian .org. I'm sending that to everyone now. And you can also find my contact information and phone number listed and extension listed on the website. So please reach out. I look forward to hearing from you and to reading many of your applications. Any final comments before we sign off?
I can also just quickly mention, hi everyone, this is Wayne speaking again. If you do have questions about social finance in particular and how your organization can use that, you can also feel free to connect with me directly. My email is best at sf@innoweave.ca, or actually I see it in the chat box, it's info@innoweave.ca. Both will come to me. Thank you so much.
Great, and we'll make sure this contact information is included in the slides when they get sent out. And the webinar as it has been recorded will also be available for you to review it if you want to get another look or share it with anybody else. So please spread the word as well to any other candidates that you think might apply for some granting with us. Thank you so much. We'll sign off now and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.